The father kicked his son out of the house for a new wife. But then he was left alone. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. I never thought I'd be writing this story. For years I buried these memories so deep that I convinced myself they belonged to someone else. But now, at 35, with my own family and a life I've built from scratch, I feel the need to tell it. Not for sympathy, not for vindication, but because some stories demand to be told. My father wasn't always the man who chose a woman over his own blood. He used to be my hero. Growing up, it was just the two of us. My mother died when I was 7, and I watched my father crumble and then rebuild himself piece by piece. He worked double shifts at the factory, his hands permanently stained with grease and determination. Every evening, he'd come home smelling of metal and sweat, but he'd still find energy to help me with homework at our small kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg that we never quite fixed. "Education is your way out, Michael," he'd say, his finger tracing my math problems while his coffee grew cold in a chipped mug that read, "World's Greatest Dad," a Father's Day gift I'd made in 2nd grade. "Don't end up like your old man, breaking his back for pennies." But I wanted to be exactly like him. He was strong, reliable, the kind of man who fixed a neighbor's leaky faucets without being asked, and who taught me to throw a curveball in our tiny backyard every Sunday after church. Our Sundays were sacred. Pancakes for breakfast, always burned on one side because our old stove ran hot, church service where he'd sing hymns in his deep, off-key voice, and then the afternoon spent working on some project around the house. I remember the smell of sawdust and his Old Spice aftershave mixing in the garage where he taught me to use tools. "A man should know how to fix things," he'd say, guiding my small hands as we repaired a broken chair or built a birdhouse. Life breaks things all the time. The question is whether you're going to fix them or let them stay broken. Those were good years, despite the absence of my mother. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our quiet understanding. When I turned 16 and got my first job at the grocery store, he was so proud he called his brother in Michigan just to brag. When I made honor roll, he bought me a steak dinner at the fanciest restaurant in town, Denny's, because that's all we could afford, but he treated it like we were dining with kings. "This is my boy," he told the waitress, his chest puffed out with pride. "Smartest kid in his class." I believed then that nothing could break the bond we'd forged in those years of just us against the world. I was naive. Everything changed the summer before my senior year when he met Linda at the church social. She was a divorced woman with bright blonde hair and a laugh that seemed too loud for our quiet house. At first, I was happy for him. He'd been alone for so long, and I was getting ready to leave for college anyway. He deserved companionship. Linda was different from my mother, whose pictures still lined the mantelpiece. Where Mom had been gentle and soft-spoken, Linda was vivacious and opinionated. She wore perfume that made our house smell like a flower shop, and she rearranged our furniture to improve the energy flow. She brought casseroles and glass dishes and slowly began replacing our mismatched plates with her own coordinated set. "Your father deserves nice things," she'd say when I'd reach for our old familiar mugs. "A man who works as hard as he does shouldn't have to eat off chipped dishes." At first, I appreciated her efforts. The house did look nicer, more put together. Dad seemed lighter, younger somehow. He'd whistle while shaving in the morning and actually started caring about his appearance again. But slowly, subtly, things began to shift. It started with small changes. The coffee he'd always bought, the cheap store brand we'd drink while doing homework, was replaced with Linda's preferred organic blend that tasted bitter and foreign. Our Sunday pancake tradition ended because Linda was trying to help your father eat healthier. The pancakes were replaced with something she called quinoa breakfast bowls that tasted like cardboard and good intentions. "Change is good, son," Dad said when I complained. "Linda's just trying to take care of us." But it didn't feel like care, it felt like erasure. My mother's pictures began disappearing one by one. First, the wedding photo from the coffee table. It's time to move forward, Linda explained gently. Then the family portrait from the hallway. When I asked Dad about it, he just shrugged and said, Linda thought it might be healthier to focus on the present instead of dwelling on the past. Your mother's been gone 10 years, Michael. She'd want me to be happy. I wanted to argue, to tell him that forgetting wasn't the same as moving forward, but I was 18 and focused on my college applications. I told myself these were just growing pains, that every family goes through adjustments. I convinced myself that once I left for college, they'd find their rhythm, and everything would settle into a new normal. I was wrong. The engagement happened 6 months after they met. Dad announced it over dinner, Chinese takeout because Linda didn't cook on Tuesdays, with the kind of nervous excitement I hadn't seen since he'd surprised me with a bicycle for my 10th birthday. Linda and I are getting married, he said, reaching for her hand across our kitchen table. We want to do it soon, before you leave for college. We want you to be part of it. Linda smiled at me, but there was something calculating in her eyes, like she was measuring my reaction. I hope you're happy for us, Michael. I know this is an adjustment, but I want us to be a real family. I forced a smile and said all the right things, but something cold settled in my stomach. Maybe it was the way she said real family, as if what Dad and I had built together for 10 years was somehow lacking. Maybe it was how quickly she'd moved in, how seamlessly she'd replaced Mom's presence without ever acknowledging what had been there before. The wedding was small, held in the church where Dad and I had sat side by side every Sunday for years. Watching him at the altar in his new suit, bought by Linda because his old one was too shabby for such an important day, I felt like I was losing him to someone I barely knew. During the reception in the church basement, I sat at the head table feeling like a stranger at my own father's wedding. You look handsome, honey, Linda said to me during the cake cutting, her voice sweet but her hand possessive on Dad's arm. I got you that tie, you know. Your father's fashion sense needed some help. She laughed as if it were a joke, but I caught the edge in her voice. Even then, I should have recognized it as the sound of someone marking her territory. After the honeymoon, a weekend trip to Niagara Falls that they documented with hundreds of photos, Linda moved in completely. Suddenly, our house felt like her house with guests who'd overstayed their welcome. My things kept getting moved, organized, into spaces that made no sense. My basketball trophies from high school were relocated to a shelf in the basement to make room for our wedding photos. The books Dad and I used to read together disappeared into boxes to reduce clutter. We're making a fresh start, Linda would say whenever I questioned these changes. Out with the old, in with the new. But I was the old. And I was beginning to understand that Linda's version of a fresh start didn't include me. The first real confrontation happened during Thanksgiving of my freshman year. I'd come home from college excited to share my experiences, to reconnect with Dad over our traditional turkey dinner and football game. But Linda had other plans. We're doing Thanksgiving differently this year, she announced when I walked into a house that smelled like vanilla candles instead of turkey and stuffing. My sister and her family are coming over, and we're having a more sophisticated meal. I've prepared duck with orange glaze and quinoa stuffing. I looked at Dad, expecting him to protest, to remember our tradition of watching the game while eating turkey sandwiches with too much mayonnaise. But he just nodded and said, Linda's worked really hard on this meal, son. It'll be nice to do something different. Different. Everything was different now. Linda's sister Patricia arrived with her husband and 2 young children, and suddenly I was relegated to the kids' table, literally. There's just not enough room at the main table, Linda explained with fake regret, but you'll have fun with the little ones. I was 19 years old, sitting at a card table with a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, while the adults discussed Linda's redecorating plans and Patricia's new business venture. When I tried to join their conversation, Linda would redirect the topic or suggest I help with the children. Dad barely looked at me during the entire meal. When I tried to catch his eye, he was absorbed in Patricia's stories about her vacation to Europe, or nodding along as Linda discussed her plans to modernize the kitchen. It was as if I were invisible, a ghost, haunting a house that was no longer mine. That night, I tried to talk to him about it. I found him in the garage, our old sanctuary, but even that space had been transformed. Linda's car occupied the spot where we used to work on projects, and all his tools had been organized, into a system that made no sense to either of us. "Dad, can we talk?" He looked up from a box he was sorting through, and I noticed how tired he looked. "What's on your mind, son?" "I feel like I don't fit here anymore. Like everything's changed and there's no place for me." He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Michael, you're in college now. You're supposed to be building your own life. This house, it's not meant to be your permanent home anymore. But it's still my home, isn't it? I mean, when I come back for breaks? Of course it is. But Linda and I were trying to build something together. She's never had a family before, never had a chance to be a mother. You need to give her space to figure that out. What about us? What about our traditions? Our history? You can't live in the past forever, Michael. Your mother's been gone for 12 years. It's time to move forward." But moving forward, I was learning, meant moving away from everything that had mattered to us. Each visit home became more uncomfortable, more awkward. Linda's presence filled every space. Her opinions colored every conversation. Her needs took precedence over everything else. By my sophomore year, I dreaded going home. The house felt hostile, like I was an intruder in my childhood bedroom that Linda had updated with new curtains and decorations that had nothing to do with me. My old posters were gone, my books boxed up, my furniture rearranged to fit Linda's aesthetic. "We're turning this into a proper guest room," she explained when I stared at the unfamiliar space. "Now that you're practically grown, it makes sense to make it more versatile." Guest room. I was a guest in my father's house. The worst part was watching Dad change. The man who'd taught me to stand up for myself, to fight for what mattered, had become someone who deferred to Linda's wishes without question. When she criticized the way I loaded the dishwasher or complained about my college attitude, he'd nod and suggest I try to be more considerate. "She's adjusting too, son. This is new for all of us." But it wasn't new anymore. It had been 2 years, and the only thing that seemed to be adjusting was Dad's relationship with me, shrinking a little more with each visit until it felt like we were polite strangers sharing uncomfortable small talk. The breaking point came during Christmas break of my junior year. I'd been looking forward to spending time with Dad, maybe recapturing some of our old closeness. I even brought him a present I'd been working on all semester, a photo album I'd put together of all our memories before Linda, from little league games to fishing trips to quiet moments in the garage. But when I arrived home, I found that Linda had invited her sister's family to stay for the entire week. The house was full of Patricia's children, who'd taken over every space, including my room. "You don't mind sleeping on the couch, do you, honey?" Linda asked, not really asking. "The children need a proper bedroom, and Patricia and James need privacy." I looked at Dad, waiting for him to protest, to point out that this was still my home too. But he just shrugged apologetically and said, "It's only for a few days, son. We can catch up next week when everyone's gone." Except we never did catch up because something was always taking precedence over our time together. Linda's social obligations, her sister's needs, her plans for reorganizing the house. I spent the week feeling like a homeless person camping in what used to be my own living room, listening to other people's children play with toys that had replaced my childhood memories. On Christmas morning, I gave Dad the photo album. I watched his face as he flipped through the pages, seeing our history together. Fishing trips, baseball games, quiet moments working on projects. For a moment, his eyes got misty, and I thought maybe he remembered what we'd lost. "This is really nice, Michael. Thank you." But Linda leaned over his shoulder, looking at the pictures with a frown. "Oh my, these are so old. Look how different you look, honey. And this house? God, it was so dated then, wasn't it? Thank goodness we've modernized everything." She laughed, but it sounded sharp. "Michael, sweetie, you really should focus on making new memories instead of dwelling on the past. It's not healthy to be so nostalgic." Dad closed the album and set it aside. "Linda's right, son. These are nice memories, but we should focus on building new traditions." New traditions that didn't include me, I realized. New traditions where Linda's family took precedence, where her opinions mattered more than our history, where I was increasingly seen as a relic of Dad's past rather than a part of his future. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found the photo album in the kitchen trash can, buried under wrapping paper and empty boxes. Linda had thrown it away. I should have confronted them then. I should have demanded explanations, fought for my place in Dad's life, made him choose between his past and his future. Instead, I quietly retrieved the album and packed it in my suitcase, along with the growing certainty that I was no longer welcome in my father's house. The final blow came the following summer. I'd graduated college with honors and was trying to figure out my next steps. The job market was tough, and I'd hoped to move back home temporarily while I looked for work and saved money for my own place. It seemed reasonable. Other friends were doing the same thing, and I'd been contributing to household expenses with my part-time job since high school. But when I called Dad to discuss the plan, Linda answered the phone. "Oh, Michael, honey, that's going to be a problem," she said in her sweetest voice. "We've already committed to letting Patricia's oldest son stay with us for the summer. He's looking for work too, and well, there just isn't room for both of you. What about the basement? I could fix it up, make it livable." "Oh no, we can't have you living in the basement like some kind of vagrant. What would people think?" Besides, Linda started using it for her yoga and meditation space. It would be terribly disruptive. I asked to speak to Dad, but she said he was at work and couldn't be disturbed. But we discussed it, and we both think it would be better for you to find your own place. You're a college graduate now, Michael. It's time to be independent. When I finally reached Dad that evening, he essentially repeated Linda's words, but with less conviction. I could hear her in the background, and I realized she was coaching him through the conversation. "It's not personal, son. It's just that we've made commitments, and you're old enough to take care of yourself. This will be good for you. Build character. Teach you self-reliance. Dad, I just need a few months to get on my feet. I've been your son for 22 years. Doesn't that count for something?" There was a long pause, and I thought maybe I'd gotten through to him. Then Linda's voice in the background. "Tell him about building character, honey. About how this is what's best for him. Michael, this is what's best for you. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet." That's when I knew I'd lost him completely. The man who'd once told me that family always came first, who'd worked double shifts to provide for us, who'd taught me that love meant sacrifice. That man was gone, replaced by someone who'd chosen comfort over loyalty, a new wife over his only child. I hung up the phone and sat in my dorm room, which I'd have to vacate in 2 days, with nowhere to go and $847 in my bank account. I was 22 years old, a college graduate with good grades and no prospects, and I'd just been made homeless by the person I'd trusted most in the world. The rage came first. Hot, consuming anger at Linda for systematically destroying my relationship with my father. At Dad for letting her do it. At myself for not fighting harder to preserve what we'd had. I wanted to drive to the house and confront them both, to demand they honor the bonds of blood over the convenience of a new marriage. But the rage was quickly replaced by something worse, a hollow, aching sadness that felt like grief. Because I realized I wasn't just losing my home. I was losing my father, the man who'd shaped my understanding of love, loyalty, and family. The man who'd promised we'd always be a team was choosing someone else's team, and I wasn't invited to play. I cried that night for the first time since my mother's funeral. I cried for the father I'd lost, for the home that was no longer mine, for the future I'd imagined where I'd bring my own children to visit Grandpa and we'd all sit around that wobbly kitchen table making new memories. But by morning, the tears were gone, replaced by a cold determination that surprised me with its clarity. If they wanted me to be independent, fine. If they wanted me to build character through struggle, I'd show them exactly what I was capable of building. I used my savings to rent a tiny studio apartment in a rough part of town, the kind of place where the neighbors played music too loud and the hallways smelled like cooking grease and disappointment. My furniture consisted of a mattress on the floor, a card table, and a folding chair I'd bought at a garage sale. For the first month, I ate peanut butter sandwiches and ramen noodles while I looked for work. The isolation was the hardest part. I'd grown up with the certainty that I had someone to call when things got tough, someone who'd offer advice or just listen when I needed to talk. Now I was truly alone, and the silence of my empty apartment echoed with all the conversations I couldn't have with my father. I found work at a construction company doing manual labor that reminded me of Dad's factory job, but paid better. The work was hard, but it felt honest, and my supervisor, a gruff man named Tony, who'd built his own business from nothing, became something like a mentor. "Kid, you've got good hands and a good attitude," he told me after my first month. "You stick around, learn the trade, and I'll teach you everything I know about construction. This business can make you a good living if you're willing to work for it." I threw myself into the job, working overtime whenever possible, saving every penny I could. At night, I took business classes at the community college, learning about accounting, project management, customer service. I had a plan forming, not just to survive on my own, but to build something that would prove my worth, to everyone, but especially to myself. During those first difficult months, I kept waiting for Dad to call, to check on me, to ask how I was managing. The phone never rang. I told myself he didn't know how to reach me, but I'd given Linda my new number, and I knew she'd passed it along. The silence was a choice, and that realization hurt more than any harsh words could have. On my birthday, my 23rd, I sat in my apartment eating a convenience store cupcake and remembered how Dad used to make such a big deal about birthdays. He'd wake me up singing Happy Birthday off-key and cook my favorite breakfast, pancakes with too much syrup and bacon burned crispy the way I liked it. We'd spend the day doing whatever I wanted, and he'd give me a present he'd usually been saving for months. The phone sat silent on my card table, and I finally understood that I was truly orphaned now, not by death, but by choice. His choice to prioritize his new life over our shared history. But I survived that birthday and the next one, and gradually the silence stopped hurting so much. I made new friends at work and school, people who knew nothing about my past or my complicated relationship with my father. I started dating a woman named Sarah, who worked at the coffee shop near my apartment, someone who appreciated my work ethic and wasn't put off by my humble circumstances. "You're building something," she told me one night as we sat on the floor of my apartment, sharing takeout Chinese food and talking about our dreams. "I can see it in how you talk about your job, about school. You're not just working, you're creating a foundation for something bigger." She was right. 2 years after being kicked out, I'd been promoted to crew supervisor and had earned my associate degree in business. Tony was teaching me about bidding jobs, managing subcontractors, and the 1,000 small details that separated successful contractors from those who struggled. I was making decent money, had moved to a better apartment, and was starting to think about the future in terms of possibilities rather than just survival. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was building the kind of life Dad had always wanted for me: steady work, education, self-reliance. But he wasn't there to see it, wasn't there to offer advice or celebrate my small victories. I'd achieved independence, but the cost had been the relationship that had once meant everything to me. I thought about calling him sometimes, especially during milestones or difficult moments. When I got my degree, when I was promoted, when Sarah and I got engaged, when Tony offered to make me a partner in his business. But something always held me back. Pride, maybe, or the fear that he'd be polite but distant, treating me like an acquaintance rather than his son. Years passed. I married Sarah in a small ceremony attended by friends and Tony's family who'd become like surrogate parents to me. We bought a small house. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. And I'd done much of the renovation work myself using the skills I'd learned on job sites. Tony retired and sold me the business, which I'd grown into a reputable general contracting company specializing in residential renovations. By the time I was 30, I had everything I'd ever wanted: a successful business, a wife who loved me, a home we'd built together, and the respect of my community. I'd proven I could thrive without my father's support, could build a life based on my own efforts and values. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about him, didn't wonder how he was doing, didn't hope that someday he'd reach out and we could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. The angry young man who'd been kicked out of his father's house had matured into someone who understood that relationships were complex, that people made mistakes, that forgiveness was possible if both parties were willing to do the work. Sarah gave birth to our son when I was 32, and holding that tiny, perfect baby in my arms, I thought about my own father and wondered if he ever regretted the choices he'd made. I named the boy David, after my dad, because despite everything that had happened, I wanted to honor the man who'd shaped my early years, who'd taught me about work and integrity and love, even if he'd forgotten those lessons later. I sent Dad a birth announcement, along with a photo and a note saying that he had a grandson, and that we'd welcome him in our lives if he wanted to be part of them. The note came back marked, "Return to sender, moved, no forwarding address." He was gone, and I didn't even know where. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March when, David was 2 and Sarah was pregnant with our second child. I was reviewing job estimates at the kitchen table when the phone rang. Sarah answered, and I heard her say, "Yes, this is the right number. Hold on." She covered the phone and whispered, "It's someone asking about your father. Says it's urgent." My hands shook as I took the phone. "This is Michael." "Mr. Peterson, this is Janet Williams from Mercy General Hospital. I'm calling about your father, David Peterson. He's been admitted here, and he listed you as his emergency contact. I'm afraid his condition is quite serious." The words hit me like cold water. Dad was sick, alone, and I was still his emergency contact after all these years of silence. "What's wrong with him?" "He's had a severe heart attack, and there are complications. He's been asking for you. Can you come?" I looked at Sarah, at our son playing with blocks on the floor, at the life I'd built in the absence of my father's love. Every rational part of me said I should hang up, should protect the peace I'd found, should refuse to be hurt again by someone who'd made his choices clear years ago. But he was my father, and he was dying, and he was asking for me. "I'll be there in an hour." The drive to the hospital felt like traveling back in time. I hadn't been in Dad's city for 8 years, and seeing familiar landmarks brought back a flood of memories. The high school where I'd played basketball, the church where we'd worshiped together, the neighborhoods where I'd delivered newspapers as a kid. I almost drove past our old house, curious to see how Linda had changed it, but I forced myself to go straight to the hospital. Whatever this was about, it needed to happen in the present, not in the shadows of our shared past. Dad looked small in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with artificial urgency. He'd aged more than the 8 years since I'd seen him, his hair completely gray now, his face gaunt and pale. But when he saw me walk into the room, his eyes lit up with something that looked like relief. "Michael, you came." "Of course I came, Dad. How are you feeling?" "Like I'm dying," he said, with a weak laugh that turned into a cough. Which, according to the doctors, I probably am. I sat in the chair beside his bed, not sure what to say. The anger I'd carried for years felt suddenly irrelevant in the face of his mortality, replaced by a complex mixture of sadness, love, and uncertainty. "Where's Linda?" I asked. His face darkened. "Gone. Left me about 3 years ago for some real estate agent in Florida. Took half of everything I had and said I was too old and boring for her." He looked at me with eyes that held a lifetime of regret. "Turns out you can't build a marriage on just loneliness and convenience." "I'm sorry. Are you?" "I wasn't sure you would be, after..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "After you chose her over me?" He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I was an old fool, Michael. I was so scared of being alone after your mother died, so desperate for someone to make me feel young and want it again, that I let Linda convince me that starting fresh meant forgetting everything that came before. Including me. Including you. The most important thing in my life, and I threw it away for a woman who didn't even stick around when things got tough." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of 8 years of separation hanging between us. Finally, Dad spoke again. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but I need to tell you something. After Linda left, I tried to find you. I hired a private investigator, drove to your old college, called every Peterson in 3 counties. I wanted to apologize, to try to make things right, but I didn't know where to start. I've been in the same city the whole time, Dad. I sent you a birth announcement when David was born. I never got it. Linda was handling all the mail, and she..." He closed his eyes. "She probably threw it away, just like she threw away everything else that connected me to my real life. You have a grandson. His name is David, after you. He's 2 years old." Dad's face crumpled, and he began to cry in earnest. "I've missed so much. Your wedding, your business, becoming a grandfather. I've missed watching you become the man I always knew you could be. I built a construction company, Dad, just like you taught me, with hard work and integrity. I married a good woman who loves me, and we have a house that I renovated myself using the skills you taught me in our garage. I'm so proud of you, son, and so sorry for what I put you through. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I needed you to know that losing you was the biggest mistake of my life. Bigger than marrying Linda, bigger than selling the house, bigger than any of the other stupid decisions I made. You were the best thing I ever did, and I threw you away." Looking at him lying there, frail and repentant. I felt the anger I'd carried for so many years finally begin to dissolve. Not because what he'd done was forgivable, but because holding on to it was poisoning my own happiness. I had a choice to make, the same choice he'd faced years ago between past and present, between grudges and grace. I forgave you a long time ago, Dad. I was just waiting for you to forgive yourself. He squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left. Can you tell me about David? About my grandson? Asa. For the next 2 hours, I told him everything. About Sarah, about the business, about little David's first steps and first words. I showed him pictures on my phone and watched his face light up at each image. It wasn't enough to make up for 8 years of absence, but it was a beginning. I want to meet him, Dad said. I know I don't deserve to be part of his life, but if you'd let me, I'd like to try to be the grandfather I should have been. We'd like that too. And Sarah, does she know about me? She knows everything. She's the one who convinced me to answer the phone tonight, actually. She said family is messy and complicated, but it's still family. Smart woman. You chose better than I did. Dad lived for 6 more months after that first conversation. They were difficult months, filled with medical complications and gradual decline, but they were also precious months that allowed us to rebuild what had been broken between us. He met David, who took to his grandfather with the easy affection of a child who knows nothing about past grievances. He was there when Sarah gave birth to our daughter Emma, and he cried when she wrapped her tiny fingers around his weathered hand. We talked about everything during those months. My mother, his regrets, my resentment, our shared memories of better times. He told me stories about his childhood that he'd never shared before, and I told him about the dark years after he'd kicked me out, about learning to survive on my own, about building a life from scratch. You're stronger than I ever was, he said one afternoon as we sat in his small apartment, watching David play with wooden blocks. I broke when your mother died, let fear make my decisions for me. But you didn't break when I abandoned you. You bent, but you didn't break. And that's the difference between us. You taught me how to be strong, Dad. Even when you forgot your own lessons, they were still inside me. I'm glad for that. It means I did something right, even if I did everything else wrong. He died on a Sunday morning in October, peacefully in his sleep. I was holding his hand, and his last words were, "Tell David his grandpa loved him." We buried him next to my mother, in the cemetery where we used to visit her grave every year before Linda convinced him to stop living in the past. At the funeral, I delivered the eulogy, speaking about the man who'd raised me and the lessons he'd taught me about work, integrity, and love. I didn't mention Linda or the years of separation because that wasn't the story I wanted to tell about my father's life. I wanted to honor the man who'd made pancakes every Sunday morning and taught me to throw a curveball, not the man who'd lost his way in the middle of his story. After the service, as I stood by his grave with Sarah and the children, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep gratitude for the time we'd had together. Both the early years when he'd been my hero, and the final months when he'd found the courage to face his mistakes and try to make them right. Will you tell them about Grandpa David? Sarah asked, nodding toward our children. I'll tell them about the man who taught me that love means showing up, even when it's difficult. That family is about more than blood. It's about choice, about commitment, about fighting for what matters. I'll tell them that people make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, but that doesn't mean they're beyond redemption if they're willing to do the hard work of earning forgiveness. And about Linda? I thought about that for a long moment. I'll tell them that sometimes people come into our lives who seem to offer what we need, but who actually want to take away what we have. I'll teach them to recognize the difference between someone who loves them for who they are and someone who wants to change them into who they think they should be. As we walked away from the cemetery, David asked if Grandpa was happy now. Yes, buddy, he's with Grandma and he's happy. Will we see him again? Someday, but for now, we'll remember him by being kind to each other and working hard and taking care of the people we love. It's been 5 years since Dad died, and I think about him often, not with the bitter resentment I once carried, but with a complex understanding of how fragile human relationships can be, how easily they can be damaged by fear, pride, and poor choices. I think about how he lost himself in those middle years, how Linda's influence slowly eroded his sense of who he was and what mattered to him, until he became someone I barely recognized. But I also think about redemption, about second chances, about the courage it takes to admit you've made terrible mistakes. In his final months, Dad showed me that it's never too late to choose love over pride, family over convenience, truth over comfortable lies. He couldn't undo the damage he'd caused, but he could acknowledge it, apologize for it, and try to build something better from the ruins. My business has grown over the years. We now employ 12 people and have a reputation for quality work and fair dealing. I've taught several young men the trade, the way Tony taught me, passing along not just technical skills but the values that matter. Showing up on time, doing honest work, treating people with respect, keeping your word. When they ask me about success, I tell them it's not about the money or the recognition, but about building something that lasts, something you can be proud of. David is 7 now, old enough to help me with small projects around the house. I watch him handle tools with the same careful attention Dad taught me, and I see the continuity of generations, the way knowledge and values pass from father to son, despite the breaks and interruptions that sometimes occur. Emma is 5, brilliant and fearless, already showing signs that she'll surpass us all in whatever she chooses to pursue. Sometimes when I'm working with David in our garage, the same kind of space where Dad first taught me to use my hands and my mind, I hear echoes of my father's voice in my own instruction. Measure twice, cut once. The right tool for the right job. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. The lessons survived even when the relationship didn't, passed down through muscle memory and moral conviction. Sarah and I have built the kind of marriage I once thought was impossible, based on mutual respect, honest communication, and the understanding that love is a choice you make every day, not just a feeling that happens to you. We've weathered difficulties together, supported each other through challenges, and never forgotten that we're on the same team, working toward the same goals. When friends ask me about forgiveness, about whether I really let go of my anger toward Dad, I tell them it wasn't a single moment of grace but a gradual process of choosing healing over hurt, growth over grievance. I had to learn that forgiveness isn't about pretending the damage never happened, but about refusing to let that damage define your future. Linda never contacted us, never acknowledged Dad's death, or expressed any regret for her role in our separation. I used to fantasize about confronting her, about making her understand the pain she'd caused, but I've come to see that as a waste of energy. She made her choices, faced their consequences, and moved on to whatever life she built for herself. Her story is not mine to tell or judge. The house where I grew up was sold after Dad's death to pay his medical bills. I drove by it once, curious to see how the new owners had changed it, and was surprised to feel nothing but mild nostalgia. It was just a building now, not a repository of dreams and disappointments. The real home, the love, the lessons, the foundation of character, I'd carried with me all along. Last month, David asked me about his grandfather, prompted by a school assignment about family history. I told him about the man who'd taught me to work with my hands, who'd made pancakes on Sunday mornings, who'd been proud of my achievements and disappointed by my failures, but who'd loved me regardless. I told him about mistakes and forgiveness, about the importance of choosing the people in your life carefully, about the difference between temporary comfort and lasting loyalty. Was Grandpa a good man? David asked. He was a flawed man who tried to be good, I said. Like most of us. He made some terrible mistakes, but he also did some wonderful things. The important thing is that he taught me how to be a father, even when he forgot how to be one himself. I've learned that this is perhaps the greatest gift we can give our children. Not perfection, but honesty about our struggles, our mistakes, our efforts to do better. I want David and Emma to understand that love doesn't mean never disappointing each other, but it does mean showing up to repair the damage when we do. As I write this, sitting in my study while my family sleeps upstairs, I'm struck by how different my life could have been if I'd chosen bitterness over growth, isolation over connection, revenge over reconciliation. The young man who was kicked out of his father's house at 22 could have become someone consumed by anger, determined to prove his worth through spite and success. Instead, I hope I've become someone who understands that true strength lies not in never falling down, but in getting back up, not in never being hurt, but in refusing to let hurt turn you cruel. Dad was wrong about many things, But he was right about this. Love isn't something you feel. It's something you do. It's showing up every day, even when it's difficult. It's choosing your family's well-being over your own comfort. It's admitting when you're wrong and working to make it right. It's building something that will last beyond your own lifetime, not just in terms of business success or material wealth, but in terms of values, character, and the kind of love that survives even the worst mistakes. The man who once told me that a father's job is to prepare his children for a world without him succeeded more than he knew. He gave me the tools I needed not just to survive on my own, but to build a life worth living, a family worth protecting, a legacy worth leaving. And in the end, that's the story I choose to tell about David Peterson. Not the man who lost his way in the middle of his life, but the man who found it again at the end, who remembered what mattered most just in time to pass it on to the next generation. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't avoiding the battle, but learning from the defeat. Sometimes the most important lesson isn't how to never fall, but how to get back up. And sometimes the most profound love story isn't about never being hurt by someone, but about choosing to love them anyway, choosing to forgive them, choosing to honor the best parts of what you shared together. My father taught me all of these lessons, some through his wisdom and some through his failures. In the end, they all led to the same place. A deeper understanding of what it means to be a man, a father, a human being trying to do right by the people who matter most. That understanding is what I'm passing on to my children, along with the sure knowledge that they are loved unconditionally, that they will always have a place in my home and my heart, and that no person, no matter how persuasive or charming, will ever convince me to choose temporary happiness over permanent loyalty to the family I've been blessed to call my own.